It was a typical Tuesday morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, buzzing with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to catch their flights. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh pretzels from the nearby kiosks, while announcements echoed through the terminals. At Gate 27, passengers were lining up to board a routine flight bound for Washington, D.C. Among them stood Clara Dawson, a middle-aged corporate lawyer known for her sharp suits, sharper tongue, and an unshakable belief that rules existed to be followed without question. Clara had arrived early, as she always did, wanting to secure a good spot in line. She liked being among the first to board so she could settle into her seat comfortably before the plane filled up. Today, she was seated in first class, a perk of booking last minute but willing to pay extra for convenience. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, clutching her leather briefcase and designer handbag, she scanned the cabin ahead. Everything seemed normal. Rows of plush seats, neatly folded blankets, and attendants greeting passengers with practiced smiles. But then, something caught her eye, or rather someone. Sitting across the aisle in one of the coveted first-class seats was an elderly black man. His name was Walter Thompson, though Clara didn't know that yet. He was dressed simply, wearing a faded blazer over a plain white shirt. His face bore the marks of time, deep creases around his eyes and streaks of gray in his closely cropped hair. But there was a calmness about him, a quiet dignity that made him stand out despite his modest appearance. Walter moved slowly, carefully, stowing his small duffel bag in the overhead compartment. It wasn't much, just a simple canvas sack with frayed edges, the kind you might see in thrift stores. To Clara, it looked out of place in the polished luxury of first class. She frowned, slightly, watching him take his time. Her irritation grew when he finally sat down, pulling out a worn paperback book and adjusting himself in the seat like he belonged there. "This can't be right," Clara muttered under her breath. She glanced at her boarding pass again to double-check. Her seat assignment. Yes, this was definitely first class. And yet here was this man, this stranger, occupying space meant for people who paid top dollar for comfort and exclusivity. Without wasting another second, Clara flagged down a passing flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice polite but firm. "I think there's been some mistake. That man," she gestured toward Walter, "he shouldn't be sitting here. This is first class." The flight attendant, a young woman named Lisa, blinked in surprise. "Let me check, ma'am," she replied diplomatically. She approached Walter with a warm smile. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Walter looked up from his book, startled but courteous. He reached into his pocket and handed over the slip of paper. Lisa examined it closely, her eyebrows rising ever so slightly. Then she turned back to Clara. "Ma'am, Mr. Thompson has a valid first-class ticket. There's no error." Clara's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected this response. Surely, there had to be some misunderstanding. People like him, and here her thoughts betrayed a flicker of bias she rarely acknowledged, didn't belong in first class. They belonged in coach, where they wouldn't disrupt the experience of paying customers. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely certain? Maybe he accidentally took someone else's seat." Her tone carried more than a hint of skepticism. Lisa hesitated, glancing between Clara and Walter. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, ma'am, his ticket is correct. He's supposed to be here." For a moment, Clara considered arguing further, but then she decided on a different approach. Turning directly to Walter, she spoke in a clipped, authoritative tone. "Sir, I don't mean to inconvenience you, but would you mind moving to economy? You'd probably be more comfortable back there." Walter looked at her, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, quietly, almost too softly for Clara to hear, he responded, "If you insist." He gathered his belongings, the same slow, deliberate movements he'd used earlier, and stood up. Without another word, he shuffled past her and headed toward the rear of the plane, disappearing into the crowded expanse of coach seating. Clara watched him go, feeling a mix of satisfaction and relief. Order had been restored. First class was once again reserved for those who deserved it. What Clara didn't realize, however, was that her actions had set off a chain reaction. One that would soon reveal far more about Walter than anyone aboard the plane could have anticipated. For now, though, she settled back into her seat, flipping open her laptop and sipping her complimentary mimosa, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface of what seemed like an ordinary flight. As the plane taxied down the runway, its engines roaring to life, the cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight energy. Passengers adjusted their seatbelts, tucked away loose items, and prepared for takeoff. Clara Dawson, seated comfortably in her first-class window seat, sipped her mimosa and scrolled through emails on her phone. She had already pushed the earlier incident with Walter out of her mind, dismissing it as a minor inconvenience that had been swiftly resolved. Meanwhile, at the back of the plane, Walter Thompson settled into his new seat in economy. The space was cramped compared to the spacious luxury of first class, but he didn't complain. He simply opened his worn paperback book again, leaning slightly to avoid bumping elbows with the passenger beside him. His calm demeanor masked any hint of frustration or disappointment. To Walter, this was just another moment in a long life filled with challenges he'd learned to navigate quietly and with grace. But unbeknownst to either Clara or Walter, whispers were beginning to ripple through the cabin crew. Lisa, the flight attendant who had checked Walter's ticket earlier, couldn't shake the feeling that something about him seemed familiar. As she moved down the aisle, handing out blankets and pillows, she discreetly shared her thoughts with another colleague. "That man we moved from first class, he looks so much like someone I saw in a documentary once. A veteran, maybe?" Her coworker frowned, intrigued. "Really? What's his name?" "Thompson," Lisa replied softly. "Walter Thompson." The second flight attendant froze mid-step, her eyes widening. "Wait, did you say Walter Thompson?" She glanced around nervously, lowering her voice. "I think I've heard that name before. Let me check the manifest." A few moments later, after sneaking a quick peek at the passenger list, the truth became undeniable. Walter Thompson wasn't just any traveler. He was a decorated Vietnam War veteran, a recipient of the Medal of Honor, no less, the highest military honor awarded by the United States, reserved only for acts of extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty. Word traveled quickly among the crew. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, nearly everyone working on board knew who Walter was. They exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. How could such a humble man, sitting quietly in economy, have accomplished so much? And why hadn't anyone realized sooner? Eventually, the information made its way to Captain Robert Hayes, the pilot overseeing the flight. A tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair, Captain Hayes exuded authority and kindness in equal measure. Like many pilots, he prided himself not only on his technical skills, but also on fostering a sense of respect and camaraderie among passengers and crew alike. When one of the flight attendants approached him during a quiet moment in the cockpit, her voice trembling slightly, he listened intently. "Captain," she began hesitantly, "there's something you need to—" "No, one of our passengers. He's a Medal of Honor recipient, and earlier he was asked to leave first class because someone thought he didn't belong there." Hayes's brow furrowed instantly. "What do you mean, asked to leave?" he demanded, his tone sharp yet controlled. The attendant explained what had happened. The confrontation between Clara and Walter, the forced relocation, and how Walter had complied without protest. By the time she finished recounting the story, Hayes was visibly upset. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the control panel. Though he couldn't see Clara from where he sat, he could picture the scene all too clearly. It wasn't just about seating arrangements. It was about dignity, respect, and recognizing the sacrifices of those who had given so much for their country. Hayes leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He had served in the Air Force earlier in his career, and though his path had taken him to civilian aviation, he still carried the values of service and honor with him every day. Stories like Walter's resonated deeply with him. They reminded him of friends and comrades who had risked everything some of whom hadn't come home. The idea that someone like Walter could be treated dismissively, especially on his watch, was unacceptable. "We can't let this stand," Hayes said finally, turning to his co-pilot. "We owe it to Mr. Thompson, and to everyone else on this plane, to set things right." His co-pilot nodded solemnly. "What do you have in mind?" Hayes thought for a moment, then signaled for the lead flight attendant to join them. Together, they devised a plan that would not only rectify the situation, but also ensure that Walter received the recognition he deserved. The decision was clear. Walter needed to return to first class not as a favor, but as a symbol of gratitude and respect. More importantly, the entire cabin needed to understand exactly who they were sharing the flight with. When the meeting concluded, Hayes gave a firm nod. "Let's make this happen," he said, "and let's do it respectfully." With that, the wheels were set in motion. Little did the passengers know their ordinary Tuesday morning flight was about to become anything but routine. For Walter Thompson, the journey ahead promised to be far more meaningful than he could have ever imagined. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the hum of the engine settled into a steady rhythm, and the cabin fell into its usual mid-flight routine. Passengers relaxed in their seats, some reading books or watching movies on their screens, others chatting quietly with their neighbors, and a few drifting off to sleep. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, offering snacks and drinks. Everything seemed normal, just another uneventful journey through the skies. But then, without warning, the intercom crackled to life. Captain Robert Hayes's voice cut through the cabin, calm yet commanding, instantly drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I hope you're all comfortable and enjoying the flight so far." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I'd like to take a moment to address something important, a matter that deserves our collective respect and gratitude." The tone of his voice was different from the standard pre-recorded announcements passengers were used to hearing. It carried weight, sincerity, and an unmistakable sense of purpose. Heads turned toward the overhead speakers as people sat up straighter, curious about what he might say next. Even those engrossed in their personal devices paused to listen. "I want to bring to your attention," Captain Hayes continued, "that we have a very special individual traveling with us today. His name is Mr. Walter Thompson, and he is seated near the rear of the aircraft. Many of you may not know this, but Mr. Thompson is a true American hero, a decorated veteran who served our country with extraordinary bravery during the Vietnam War." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged surprised glances while others craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the man being described. Clara Dawson, still seated in first class, froze mid-sip of her coffee. Her heart skipped a beat as realization dawned on her. She suddenly understood why the crew had been whispering earlier, and worse, she realized that the announcement was directly tied to her actions at the gate. Captain Hayes went on, his voice growing firmer. "Mr. Thompson is a recipient of the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States. This honor is reserved for acts of incredible courage and selflessness, often performed under the most dangerous circumstances. During his service, Mr. Thompson risked his own life to save dozens of his fellow soldiers, displaying a level of heroism that few of us can even imagine." By now, the entire cabin was silent, every ear tuned to the captain's words. There was no rustling of papers, no clicking of seatbelt buckles, just a profound stillness as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what they were hearing. For many, it was hard to reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming man sitting in economy with the larger-than-life story being shared over the intercom. "Unfortunately," Captain Hayes added, his tone shifting slightly, "earlier today, Mr. Thompson was unjustly asked to leave his rightful seat in first class. While I cannot speak to the specifics of what happened, I can tell you that such treatment is unacceptable. As your pilot, and as someone who has worn a uniform myself, I feel it is my duty to apologize to Mr. Thompson on behalf of our crew, and to ensure that he receives the recognition and respect he has earned." At these words, several passengers glanced toward the front of the plane where Clara sat stiffly in her seat. Though no names were mentioned, the implication was clear enough. Whispers began to spread. and more than a few disapproving looks were directed her way. Clara felt her face flush hot with embarrassment. She wanted nothing more than to disappear, but there was nowhere to hide aboard the crowded aircraft. "Captain, Hayes wasn't finished yet." "With that said," he announced, "I've asked our flight attendants to escort Mr. Thompson back to the first-class section where he belongs. Please join me in showing him the gratitude and admiration he deserves, not only for his service but for the example of humility and dignity he continues to set for all of us." As the intercom clicked off, the cabin erupted into spontaneous applause. Passengers clapped enthusiastically, some rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Children peeked out from behind their parents' shoulders, eager to see the man everyone was celebrating. Flight attendants hurried down the aisle toward Walter's seat, their faces glowing with pride and reverence. When they reached him, Walter looked up from his book, startled by the sudden commotion. At first he seemed unsure of what was happening, his expression a mixture of confusion and modesty. One of the attendants gently explained the situation, inviting him to return to first class. Walter hesitated, his humble nature making him reluctant to accept the offer. But when the attendant insisted, saying, "Sir, this is long overdue," he finally nodded and stood up. As Walter made his way forward, the applause grew louder. Passengers leaned into the aisles to shake his hand or pat him on the shoulder, offering heartfelt thanks and words of admiration. "Thank you for your service," one woman said, tears glistening in her eyes. A young boy held out a crayon-drawn picture of an airplane and shyly handed it to Walter, who accepted it with a warm smile. Clara watched all of this unfold from her seat, her stomach churning with guilt. She felt smaller with each step Walter took toward the front of the plane. When he finally arrived at the first-class section, Captain Hayes himself emerged from the cockpit to greet him. Dressed in his full uniform, Hayes walked straight to Walter, saluted him crisply, and then knelt beside him. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "thank you for your service. You embody everything good about this country, and it's an honor to have you aboard this flight." Walter blinked back tears, visibly moved by the gesture. In a soft but steady voice he replied, "I was just doing my duty, Captain. Thank you for your kind words." For the rest of the flight, the atmosphere in the cabin remained electric. Conversations buzzed with excitement as passengers discussed Walter's story and reflected on the lessons it carried. Some vowed to learn more about Medal of Honor recipients. Others expressed gratitude for the reminder of the sacrifices made by veterans. And though Clara tried to focus on her work, she couldn't escape the weight of her actions, or the stares of judgment from those around her. What had started as an ordinary Tuesday morning had transformed into something extraordinary. A moment of unity, reflection, and redemption high above the clouds. But for Clara, the hardest part was yet to come. By the time Walter Thompson returned to the first-class section, the energy in the cabin had shifted completely. What had started as an ordinary flight was now electric with emotion. Pride, admiration, and even a sense of collective reflection rippled through the passengers. Walter, still holding the crayon-drawn picture gifted by the young boy, took his seat near the front of the plane. Though visibly moved by the outpouring of gratitude, he remained humble, almost shy, as if unsure how to process the overwhelming attention. The applause didn't stop immediately. Passengers continued clapping, some rising from their seats for a second standing ovation. Strangers approached him one by one, shaking his hand or simply thanking him with heartfelt words. A middle-aged man traveling alone leaned over and said, "Sir, I can never repay you for what you've done for this country, but I hope you know how much we appreciate you." An elderly woman seated nearby handed him a tissue, her own eyes misty with tears. "You remind me of my late husband," she whispered. "He served too." Even the flight attendants couldn't help but linger, offering Walter complimentary drinks and snacks with genuine smiles. They made sure he was comfortable, draping a fresh blanket over his lap and adjusting his seat cushion with care. For Walter, who had spent decades living quietly and avoiding the spotlight, This sudden wave of recognition felt surreal. Yet despite the whirlwind of emotions, he accepted every gesture graciously, nodding and murmuring soft thank yous to everyone who approached him. Meanwhile, Clara Dawson sat frozen in her seat just a few rows away. The contrast between Walter's quiet dignity and her earlier behavior couldn't have been starker. She had entered the flight confident in her authority, convinced that she was right to demand Walter move. Now she felt exposed, her actions laid bare for everyone to judge. Every clap, every cheer, every word of praise directed at Walter felt like a silent rebuke aimed at her. She tried to focus on her laptop screen, pretending to review documents, but the letters blurred together as shame weighed heavily on her chest. Passengers around her weren't subtle about their disapproval. Some shot pointed glances her way, while others whispered audibly enough for her to hear. "Can you believe someone actually told him to move?" one woman asked her companion. "And in first class, no less." Another man muttered under his breath, "Some people really don't deserve to be up here." Each comment landed like a blow, chipping away at Clara's carefully constructed facade of composure. Despite the mounting discomfort, Clara forced herself to stay seated. Leaving wasn't an option, not when all eyes were already on her. Instead, she tried to rationalize her actions, replaying the scene in her mind. Hadn't she been within her rights to question whether Walter belonged in first class? After all, she hadn't known who he was at the time. But deep down, she knew the truth. Her request hadn't been about verifying his ticket. It had been about assumptions. Assumptions rooted in bias and privilege. And now those assumptions had unraveled spectacularly in front of hundreds of strangers. As the flight attendants bustled around Walter, ensuring he was settled back into his rightful seat, Captain Hayes stepped forward once again. Still dressed. In his crisp uniform, he addressed the cabin over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me in honoring Mr. Walter Thompson. Moments like these remind us of the values that truly matter: courage, humility, and service. Let's continue to treat each other with kindness and respect, for not only heroes like Mr. Thompson, but for everyone we meet along the way." The announcement drew yet another round of applause, punctuated by cheers and whistles. Someone shouted, "We love you, Walter," prompting laughter and more clapping. The mood was celebratory, almost festive, as if the entire plane had come together to honor not just Walter, but the ideals he represented. For Clara, however, the celebration felt suffocating. She wanted nothing more than for the flight to end so she could escape the scrutiny. But as the hours ticked by, something unexpected began to happen. Slowly, subtly, the atmosphere softened. Passengers who had initially been critical of her started turning their attention back to Walter, focusing on celebrating his legacy rather than dwelling on her mistake. Even the flight attendants, who had clearly disapproved of her earlier conduct, seemed willing to let the moment belong to Walter without further confrontation. This shift gave Clara a small measure of relief, but it also left her feeling conflicted. On one hand, she was grateful for the reprieve. On the other, she knew she couldn't simply brush off what had happened. The weight of her actions, and the lessons they carried, would stay with her long after the plane touched down. When the key aircraft finally began its descent into Washington, D.C., the cabin erupted into polite chatter once again. Passengers gathered their belongings, preparing to disembark. Walter, now surrounded by newfound admirers, exchanged final handshakes and hugs before stepping into the aisle. As he made his way toward the exit, people paused to let him pass, offering parting words of gratitude. "Safe travels, sir," one man said. "Take care of yourself," added another. Clara hung back, waiting until nearly everyone else had left before gathering the courage to approach Walter. Her heart pounded as she walked up to him, her voice trembling when she finally spoke. "Mr. Thompson, I'm so sorry for what I did. It was wrong, and I deeply regret it." Walter turned to face her, his expression calm and measured. For a moment he studied her silently, as though weighing her sincerity. Then, with a slight smile, he extended his hand. "Apology accepted, ma'am. We all make mistakes." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she shook his hand. In that brief exchange, she realized how much perspective she had lost in her pursuit of success and status. Walter's quiet strength and forgiveness reminded her that true greatness wasn't defined by titles or wealth. It was found in acts of kindness, humility, and the willingness to admit when you're wrong. As Walter disappeared into the terminal, surrounded by well-wishers and friends he'd made during the flight, Clara stood alone, vowing to carry the lessons of that day with her always. It wasn't just a journey from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. It was a turning point, a moment that challenged her assumptions, humbled her spirit, and opened her heart to the possibility of change. By the time the plane landed at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, the mood among the passengers had transformed entirely. What had begun as a routine flight had turned into an unforgettable journey, one filled with emotion, reflection, and unity. As the aircraft taxied to its gate, the cabin buzzed with quiet conversations. Passengers exchanged smiles, some still marveling at the extraordinary man they'd shared the flight with. Walter Thompson's story lingered in the air, a reminder of courage, sacrifice, and humility. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, signaling that it was safe to disembark, there was none of the usual rush to leave. Instead, people took their time, many lingering to thank Walter personally before stepping off the plane. Some shook his hand firmly, others hugged him, and a few even asked if they could take photos with him. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves, pointing excitedly at the Medal of Honor recipient as though he were a real-life superhero. Walter accepted each gesture graciously, his soft smile never wavering despite the attention. One by one, passengers filed out of the aircraft, leaving behind heartfelt words and promises to remember his story. A young woman paused to say, "Thank you for reminding us what true heroism looks like." An older gentleman, his voice thick with emotion, simply nodded and said, "You've inspired me today." Even the flight attendants lingered longer than usual, ensuring Walter had everything he needed before bidding him farewell with warm embraces. Clara Dawson remained seated until nearly everyone else had left. She watched from her window seat as the line of passengers dwindled, her mind replaying the events of the past few hours. The applause, the cheers, the standing ovations, all of it had been deserved, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong among those celebrating Walter's heroism. Her actions earlier had cast a shadow over the entire experience, and no matter how sincerely she regretted them, the memory of her behavior gnawed at her conscience. Finally, when the cabin was nearly empty, Clara stood and approached Walter. He was standing near the exit, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag while waiting patiently for the last few stragglers to disembark. Clara hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, she spoke softly but clearly. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice trembling slightly, I want to apologize again. What I did earlier, it was wrong. I judged you unfairly, and I'm so sorry for that." Walter turned to face her, his expression calm and unreadable. For a moment he studied her silently, his dark eyes searching hers. Then, with a faint but genuine smile, he replied, "Apology accepted, ma'am. We all make mistakes." His words were simple, yet they carried immense weight. Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes as relief washed over her. It wasn't just the apology. It was the way Walter responded without anger or resentment, offering forgiveness freely and without hesitation. In that moment, she realized how rare such grace truly was. Here was a man who had faced unimaginable challenges and dangers, yet he chose to meet her with kindness rather than judgment. "I won't forget this," Clara continued, her voice steadying. "What happened today, it's going to stay with me forever. You've reminded me of something important, something I think I forgot along the way." Walter tilted his head slightly, curious. "And what's that?" he asked gently. "That greatness isn't about titles or money," Clara admitted, her gaze dropping briefly before meeting his again. "It's about character, about doing the right thing, even when it's hard, and—" she paused, swallowing hard, "about treating others with respect, no matter who they are." Walter nodded slowly, his smile deepening. "You're on the right path, ma'am. That's all any of us can do. Keep learning, keep growing." With that, he extended his hand once more. This time, Clara shook it firmly, her gratitude evident in her tear-filled eyes. They stood there for a moment longer. Two very different people connected by an unexpected encounter high above the clouds. When Walter finally stepped off the plane, disappearing into the bustling terminal, Clara remained rooted to the spot, watching him go. As she made her way through the airport, Clara found herself replaying the day's events in her mind. Everything, the confrontation, the captain's announcement, the applause, the apology, had unfolded like scenes from a movie. Yet it wasn't fiction, it was real life, messy and complicated but brimming with opportunities for growth. Clara knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but she could choose how to move forward. Over the following weeks, Clara began making subtle changes in her life. She started volunteering at a local veterans center, listening to stories from men and women who had served their country. She attended community events honoring military heroes, determined to educate herself about the sacrifices they had made. At work, she became more mindful of her interactions with colleagues, striving to lead with empathy rather than authority. Slowly but surely, she worked to align her actions with the lessons she had learned aboard that flight. Word of Walter's presence on the plane spread beyond the passengers themselves. News outlets picked up the story after several travelers shared their experiences online. Social media posts describing the incident went viral, with thousands of people praising Walter's humility and Captain Hayes's leadership. Journalists reached out to interview Walter, but he declined most requests, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. When asked about the flight during a rare interview, he simply said, "It wasn't about me. It was about reminding folks of the values we should all strive to live by." For Clara, the aftermath of the flight served as both a reckoning and a redemption. She received messages from strangers who had read about the incident, some criticizing her initial behavior, others expressing admiration for her willingness to apologize publicly. While the criticism stung, it also reinforced her commitment to change. She understood now that accountability wasn't punishment, it was an opportunity to grow. Months later, Clara found herself back at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, boarding another flight. This time, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the gate, Walter Thompson. He was waiting to board a connecting flight, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Their eyes met briefly, and Walter gave her a small, knowing smile. Clara returned it, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't approach him. He seemed content to blend into the crowd. But seeing him reminded her of the profound impact one person's dignity and forgiveness could have. Walter hadn't sought recognition or praise. He had simply lived his life with quiet integrity, and in doing so, he had touched countless lives, including hers. The flight attendants called for boarding, and Clara moved toward the jet bridge, carrying not just her carry-on bag, but also the lessons she had learned. As the plane lifted off, the ground soaring into the sky, she looked out the window, reflecting on how far she had come since that fateful Tuesday morning. Life, she realized, was full of moments that challenged us to be better, to rise above our flaws and embrace the humanity in others. And sometimes those moments came wrapped in the unlikeliest of packages. A humble man with a worn duffel bag and a heart full of grace.